Hey everybody, welcome to another video. So in this video, I wanted to take a minute to talk about some techniques that I do not see used very often. And to start off, I have pulled up this map, which is entrenched. So if we take a look around, we can see that throughout the map, there's a lot of these, for lack of a better word, tentacles that separate some areas of land from each other. Notably, these go through the player lands. You can see they all end up going through the player bases here. And sometimes when we have tentacles going to the player bases, that sometimes implies connections. But if we think about it for a second, we should know that what's creating these cannot be connections, because connections will never be able to create an elevation difference when they are created. And also, this terrain happens to be masked, which connections can never produce a terrain mask when they are created either. And when we think about creating maps with separate zones with zone avoidance in our land generation, that's not very difficult to envision, but typically in those cases, the tentacles, they would go in between the players, as opposed to what we see here, which is going through them. So let's try and break down what's happening here by going to a test map. So this test map is very simple. Basically all we have is the player lands being grass with an other zone avoidance distance of 2. And since we haven't specified any zones, each player land will take its own independent zone. So there will be this strip of ice in between each player land. So these little strips of terrain between each player land is sort of reminiscent of what we were just looking at. But the difference is, like I was saying before, is that these tend to go in between the player lands as opposed to going through them, which is the key difference. But if we were to say that there weren't any objects here, and we wanted to create a land that was right in between these two players, we can try something like replicating the player lands again. So if we do that, we'll make this a different terrain type, dirt, and we will set the land percent to be less. We'll put a circle radius in here also. We can see that we're getting a bit closer to what we were trying to achieve here. So if we were to put a land ID on this one, so now we're in this situation where the player lands, which are creating this grass terrain, are still 100% of the area. I put this land ID on in order to remove the player objects. And what we have left over is that this strip of ice terrain is now just about intersecting the other set of player lands that we created. Now, if we take a closer look at this, we can notice something pretty consistent, is that the player land, which is dirt, will always be separated on one side by ice terrain and never on the other. We can see that on this yellow player's land, we can see that on the red player's land, and so on all the way across the map. And that's because when we have two sets of player lands, they will automatically assign the same zone to the same player. So we have a player land for the yellow player here. We have a pseudo player land for the yellow player over here, and they will not be separated by ice terrain because they are created with the same zone. Now, in some cases, if you want two sets of player lands to have different zones, you can override their zone by saying like zone 1 for this one and zone 2 for this one. And even though that got both sides of the dirt lands separated by ice terrain, it removed the tentacles because now all this grassland is now one homogeneous zone, and it doesn't need to avoid the other players, which are spread throughout this zone. In some cases, it's not a huge deal that the zone separation is not symmetrical on either side. But if that was something we wanted, if that was something that was important to our map, we'd have to do things a little differently. So first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to reduce this base size because these aren't creating any player objects, so I don't care if their base size is smaller. And for this set of player lands, I'm going to reduce the base size also and say number of tiles is going to be less also. So what we're going to do next is that instead of creating the player lands as create player land statements, we're going to create them as individual player lands. So if I were to take largely the same properties and say create land instead of create player lands, we'll say assign to player 1 and give this one a zone of 1. So this just creates a land for one player. And if I were to replicate that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, we can assign to all 8 players in the game. And since these are all the grasslands, which I want separated from each other, I can make sure that each one of these has its own independent zone ID. So if we were to test this map right now, basically that's the equivalent of just having one create player land statement. But then for this other set, I can do something very similar. I can also assign to player and give this one a zone also. So similar, that's just for one player. And if I were to repeat that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, I can make sure all of these have independent zones. And the result of this is, right, see the player objects for this grassland came back because when we combine land IDs with player assignments, the land ID always has to come second. But now that that's out of the way, we can see that we have done quite a bit of a better job here in making sure that the zone separation is always going to be symmetrical. So this dirt land is now separated on either side of the grass by ice terrain instead of having only just one side. And since we have created all of these tentacles, connections to the players through the player land, purely through the land generation section, we can do things like put elevation on this. So if we were to give all of these a base elevation of 1, now we can see that we put a little trench in between each of these player lands, which would not be possible if we used connections. And if we want to put a terrain mask on it, a terrain mask is also possible when we do it this way, which would not be possible if we had done it just using a connection generation. So at this point, it looks like we're looking pretty nice here. So we have a strip of terrain that intersects each of the player bases. We have this one, this one, this one, and similarly for all of the players in the game. But let's test another situation in which we don't have 8 players, but we only have 2. So we have something a bit different going on here. And in order to demonstrate what I'm talking about, I will put something else here. So since these sets of player lands have land ID 1, this should indicate where those origins are. So when we were testing 8-player games, in terms of the amount of freedom that each specific player land would have freedom to spawn along the circle was a lot less because we had so many points. But now that we're dealing with very few points, it becomes more and more likely that the zone separation is not going to intersect a player land. So this red player is kind of what we're after here. This terrain is going through the player base, but it looks like it's going around this player's base, leaving him kind of isolated from this terrain, which is not what we wanted. But this isn't the most difficult thing to overcome. So let's just say if we have a 2-player game, and we can just repeat these sets of lands for player 1 and player 2, the grasslands, which are not going to put player objects. We can repeat those another time. So now, when we do that, now we have a situation in which we have 6 points on this circle instead of only 4, and that forces the separation to be more in the middle. And we could repeat that another time if we wanted. So now we have 8 total points. And now it's much less likely that we're in a situation where this little strip of terrain is not going to intersect one of the player bases. So we can get rid of that town center. And if we keep generating, this should be fairly consistent now that each of those points have less freedom to spawn. Now, it is important to keep in mind that since we have player lands interdispersed throughout our map, that if we tried to create some elevation, for example, that since we have these player lands, it will automatically prevent elevation from generating on those locations, which is kind of annoying, but in most cases not the end of the world. And then also, if we were to put any terrains around with the attribute set avoid player start areas, they would avoid these land origins also, and any objects which have the attribute min distance to players will avoid these land origins also. So specifically regarding that issue, let's just say we had a bunch of relics. said min distance to players is 15. So since these are considered player lands, these relics will always have to avoid these land origins in addition to the ones that are actually containing player objects. So if we wanted them to only avoid the player lands, we would have to rely on actor areas. So for example, if we gave the town center an actor area, instead of the relics saying min distance to players 15, we'll say avoid actor area 15. Now the relics would only avoid the player lands and not these neutral land origins, which are also technically player lands also. So that's the gist of the first concept that I wanted to go over here that I thought was pretty interesting. And then the second map that I wanted to go over is called Ripple. So this has a similar thing going on in the sense that we have a river that is supposed to be intersecting each of the players' town centers. So we have river intersecting the player's town center there, and it should be everywhere. But in addition to that, we also have a second set of what seems like connections, in the sense that there's this circular road that makes its way around the map and connects all the players in a circle. And you can see that all the extra gold and stone is dispersed on this area also. So this is also something that isn't super straightforward that I thought was pretty interesting. So we'll go over this. So we're here back in the editor, and I've loaded the map into the test script at this point where the road connecting the players is not here, neither is the extra gold and stone. So what we can try first to connect the players is just start out with the connection generation section. So this is kind of a rudimentary thing. So let's see what this looks like. And if we look at it, we can see that it kind of does what we want, but this road is really thick. And even at this very small size of 1, it still looks rather unpleasant. And setting it to 0 doesn't really look very great either. If we take a look closely, it looks like there's these little strands here. So what is part of what's making this difficult is that when we are saying create connect all player lands, we have to understand that there's double player lands here. So there's a player land here and a player land here. So even if this was a situation in which we only had 8 player lands, that's one land attempting to connect to 7 other lands, which is already a lot. But now when we double it, we more than double the amount of connections we need to connect everybody, because then each of the 16 lands needs to connect with 15 other lands, and so what we're left with is probably always going to be messy. So what we can do is we can try something different. So since up at the top here we are in a situation where we know that the circle radius of the players is going to be 35 units away from the center. If we could potentially draw an area at that same radius, we could potentially try and do something with that. So in Madlands, for example, we can go into actor area mode, and we can draw a circle around the map, which is going to be at radius 35. So if the actor area ID is 1 and the radius is 3, we can try and see if we can do something with that. So I'll paste this at the very beginning of the objects section. And if, for example, we wanted to put gold and stone in this area, that shouldn't be super difficult. We can just say place a bunch of gold piles, and place an actor area 1. So if we do that, we can see that we have the golds and stones in a circle between the players. Now, there can be some situations in which this circular path between the players can be sometimes obstructed with trees. So this is a fair example of where normally we'd probably want this area to be clear of trees so we wouldn't be removing spaces for gold and stone. Same with probably over here and over here also. So one of the things that we can do, which is kind of useful, is trying to work with the blank forest terrain. So if I were to say, if I were to change the terrain class of trees in general to terrain ID 3, that would prevent them from being placed on ground. So before anything else, we're not able to place trees on the map because trees are not able to be placed on ground terrain anymore. But if we grab a placeholder, for example, then we can create the trees back, with tree being the second object, and we can avoid actor area 1. And what this will do is it brings the trees back, except for the places in which it would be intersecting that circle. So you can see that over here. This is the terrain of the rainforest, but no trees will get placed there because it's avoiding actor area 1. So that gets rid of one problem, in the sense that now we will never have trees blocking what will end up being the road. But we still, at this point, don't have a way to create a differentiable terrain. And that brings us to one of the newer features of random maps, in the sense that we can change the foundation terrain of buildings. So what I have right here is just a blank building, an invisible building. I'm changing its size to just be a 1x1 object, and I'm changing its foundation terrain to be 75, which is grassy road. So if I go find this spot where I'm placing this building in actor area 1, let's put a second object here. See, the flags are representing everywhere that that invisible building will be able to spawn. And when that building is able to spawn, since we changed its foundation terrain, it should show up when we start a standard game. Now, obviously, placing units on the map to change the terrain is not going to be able to level any elevations. And foundation terrains cannot create a terrain mask either, but it's nothing that connections would be able to do anyway, so it's not like we're missing out on anything. And essentially, as we saw at the very beginning, since we were successfully able to change the foundation terrain, once those invisible buildings are placed, they're going to change the terrain underneath to look like this road, which looks pretty nice. So those were the things I wanted to cover in this video. So hopefully it shed some light on some tricks that aren't necessarily super commonly known, but can still be used in the way of creating some nice maps. So thanks everybody for watching, and I hope you learned something.